morning, everybody. Welcome to the BPF's Fully Digested Budget Breakfast, our now traditional deep dive analysis of the budget this week. For those who don't know me, I'm Melanie Leach. I'm Chief Executive of the BPF, and I've got an absolutely stellar panel with me. I can see people coming in thick and fast, so I might just talk a little bit to allow more and more people to join, and just to remind you, those of you who are joining us, that I'm going to grill the panel for a little bit on some of the key themes of the budget, but we also want your questions. We also want your engagement, because there might be things you're particularly keen to hear from one of our panelists. So please do use the Q&A function to send in your questions. I will get through as many as I can. We're expecting a large crowd for this fantastic panel, so I may not get through all of them, but I'll get through as many as I can. So without further ado, I'm going to just introduce my panel. So I'm going to do them in the order on my screen. So I'm going to start with Alex Dean, Head of Public Affairs for the UK FTI Consulting. Morning, Alex.
Good morning.
So we've got Andrew Carter, Chief Executive, Centre for Cities, a real veteran of these events, I think. David Gauke, Head of Public Policy at Macfarlane's, but also well known to us, of course, as a former politician. Or maybe you're still a politician, David. Maybe that gene.
I'm happy with former politician, Melanie, I promise you.
Also a veteran of these events. And Cara Paciti, Senior Economist at the Resolution Foundation. The first timer with us, I think, on this event, Cara, so you're very welcome too. So, right, people are still coming in, but we will kick off so that we can make sure we get everyone away at prompt at 10 o'clock. So let's start off by talking about the politics. Let's sort of take the big picture. So David, I can't help but turn to you first on this one. So what do you think the politics of this budget were? And who's it aimed at? You know, who's this budget been for?
Well, I think it's worth just taking a sort of step back and asking what's the political strategy of the government this year, and I think it's sort of fairly clear what it is, which is Rishi Sunak sort of made an assessment of the circumstances in which he inherited, such a difficult and damaging year for the Conservative Party in 2022. And very difficult economic circumstances with living standards falling, is that to some extent he is politically writing off this year. It isn't a battle about trying to catch up with Labour today. I think there's a sort of sense that to rebuild trust, he needs to show, not tell. He needs to sort of build up, if you like, a kind of record of achievements. Play to the sort of perceived strength, which is that he is a problem solver and that he kind of gets things done, and he's an effective administrator. He knows how to govern, and to essentially kind of go about and build up a sort of a year's worth of achievements that when you get to 2024, at the time of the next election, he'll sort of point back and say, look, I did this, I did that. And we're now in a much better place than we were when I took over in the autumn of 2022. And I think if you look at it that way, I think this is what this budget is about. It is not about, crikey, what we're going to do about the kind of cost of living crisis. There are measures in there, the continuation of the energy price guarantee, the freeze on fuel duty. But this is really more about what are some of the problems that the economy faces? What could we do? What are the levers available to us? How do we improve business investment? Hence, we've got the reform of capital allowances. What are we going to do about the labour market, which is a really big constraint on the economy? So hence, measures on childcare and pensions and so on. So I think that's the sort of the political strategy behind all of this. And that is why the focus is a little bit more on things that might bring benefits in 2024, rather than address the problems in immediate problems in 2023. So they're not coming out of this expecting suddenly there's a surge in support for the Conservatives, although they'll hope that the childcare announcement in particular will be politically popular. This is more about positioning themselves in 2024 as a kind of fairly pragmatic, problem-solving type of government that they see as Sunak's strength, and I think that approach is kind of all over this budget.
Thank you, Alex. I saw you nodding there. What's your take on it?
Well, there's a lot to agree with in what David has set out. I see this as a budget that's quite determined to bring as many people back into for the first time, the workforce And if you think about a lot of the aspects of what the Chancellor announced, from the childcare point that David's already discussed, we have amongst the most expensive childcare in the world, and it's a powerful disincentive, especially for women, to re-enter the workplace. When asked, a number of young mothers say that they would rather be, all things being equal, they'd rather be in the workplace, but they can't afford to be. They can't make it work because of childcare, either because of the cost or because of the provision, or both. So the government's tried to do something at that end, that stage of life and that stage of careers. And then at the other, with the pensions reform, which is, let's be honest, mostly aimed at a relatively small cohort of very important people for political reasons, senior consultants, the most well-qualified surgeons and doctors in the NHS, who we were effectively asking to pay to carry on working. They've maxed out their pension pots. You punish provision over 40,000 a year under the old regime. You couldn't have a pot larger than £1 million. That was really affecting a number of very highly qualified people. The government would rather stay in the workplace. And the point about fiscal drag, of which we now have quite a lot, with inflation being where it is, if you leave that where it is long enough, it won't just affect doctors, it'll affect senior policemen, it'll affect head teachers and then deputy head teachers. And over time, lots and lots of people get drawn into that. So it was a budget trying at every stage in the working life to draw people back into the workplace. And we know that in part because government was quite open about making comparisons with other markets like the Netherlands, which does a better job of bringing people into the workplace. If you're sick and you would still you've got a long-term medical condition, if you are disabled, very often someone in this country with conditions like that say that they would still like to work, but their conditions mean, together with situations with employment, that they can't. So at every stage of the employment cycle, this is a budget aimed at trying to draw more people into the economically active bracket, producing more tax rather than being more net recipients of government money over time. And I think David's right about the long term. If you get it right in the immediate term, the benefit to the economy from some women returning to the workplace earlier than they would have done, it's quite small economic benefit to your GDP or whatever. But over time, the enormous benefit of women having their career improved by being able to be back in the workplace sooner and not being stymied quite often by multiple years out is profound, not just for the individual, but for the economy too. So I think that's a big part of what I would emphasize.
Thank you. Thank you. Cara, do you think the Chancellor got that balance right that both David and Alex have talked about between tackling immediate pressures on families and individuals and growing the economy and trying to fix things for the long term and look like you've got a strategy?
So I think it's definitely that was the balance he was trying to strike in his speech, of this sort of, I'm doing things in the short term to deal with kind of the immediate pressures, and then I've also got this longer term plan. I think on the cost of living pressures, definitely, I think widely kind of briefed pre-budget, so not really a surprise, but definitely welcome they did extend that energy price guarantee. I think that kind of roller coaster we're going to see prices go on would have been sort of messy, not just sort of politically for the Chancellor, but also really, really messy for consumers. And particularly people on prepayment meters who tend to be kind of towards the bottom of the income distribution. And actually the support for people on prepayment meters is also very welcome in that sort of bracket. I think the longer term, we're maybe going to come on and discuss this a bit later in full. I think some really good kind of targeting of measures towards groups. We've seen increases in economic activity in the past, so particularly kind of young women with children, and looking at kind of the reform of disability benefits. Those are both very tricky issues. It'll take a while to get those policies right. There are winners and losers, but definitely good that he's sort of tackling some of those issues. I think the kind of element that maybe lost out here was probably the public finances. He's ended up with got a big sort of windfall from the Office of Budget Responsibility in terms of much lower borrowing across the forecast due to their kind of economic updates. He did spend quite a big chunk of that, and he's now got a very, very small amount of headroom against his fiscal rules. So I think, yeah, potentially the public finances was the element that sort of lost out overall in that budget.
Thank you. And Andrew, come to you last. I see you nodding there in agreement with that point.
Yeah, I completely agree with Karen. In a sense, I think, David, I think is completely right. I agree with him. But I think what's interesting, and you see some of the announcements because of where they are and where they think they are going to be politically, some of the announcements, which I'm sure your members and the people that you deal with are going to be in favour of, things like capital allowance, expensing and such, are all temporary, right? And they're all temporary because that's just the daft fiscal rule that the government has set itself for its 5-year terms. So there's a kind of interesting dynamic, I think, about the political timescale and then the fiscal timescale, which means that some good initiatives were announced, but actually they were temporary, and that is not a good signal to send to the business community when investment is essentially flatlining.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. How do we get around that? What do we need to reinvent to be able to align, the kind of the ambitions and the framework within which it's possible to deliver? You got a view on that, Andrew?
Well, I mean, I think I think a more considered fiscal rule is probably where we'd start. I'll defer to David on that. I think that is very important. But then I think we have to be a bit more realistic about. We do need business investment. We need it on a prolonged basis, and the government, whoever it may be, needs to be a bit braver about setting that out and saying that this isn't temporary, it's permanent to a degree, and we're going to, and that's what we're looking to do. And if we have to make decisions in other places in order to accommodate that or pay for that, then we should do it.
David?
Yeah, I think the problem with the fiscal rule that they've got of debt falling in the 5th year of the forecast period as a proportion of GDP is that it can be gamed. And as Richard Hughes of the OBR has said himself, the government is gaming it a bit. At the moment, they, as Cara says, they meet it by a whisker. I mean, a tiny amount, £6.5 billion, which in the great scheme of things is negligible. And they meet it on the basis of departmental spending plans that are going to be very hard to deliver. Fuel duty going up next year in the way that it hasn't done for the previous 13 years, and the end of the more generous capital allowances regime. Now, I think you have to have fiscal rules. I think you could look at the sort of design of it, but the fundamental point here is that if we want a sort of long-term competitive tax regime that encourages investment, you've got to prioritize it. And that means that you either cut spending or you increase taxes elsewhere if you want to maintain that fiscal credibility, which I think after the events of last autumn we very definitely do. And I kind of look back, I'm not only because I was the minister at the time, but in 2010 we had a kind of long-term corporate tax roadmap which provided certainty and said this is what we are going to do over the next 5 years in terms of our approach, and that provided a great deal of certainty, and that almost matters more than the measures themselves. That degree of certainty, it's difficult to do, to be fair, at this end of a parliament. It's something that is easier to do at the beginning of the parliament, but whoever is in government after the next general election in 2024, I hope they come up with a sort of corporate tax roadmap that gives an indication what their plan is going to be over a 4 or 5 year parliament, and then businesses can work around it. Obviously, I hope it will be as competitive as possible, but that absence of strategy, and I think there is thinking about not the immediate, and it's about next year, but you could argue that it's been difficult for this government to be terribly strategic in some cases, corporate tax being an obvious one, just because of the political constraints and the fiscal constraints. And if you really want a sort of solid position here, you have to make some tough choices, and be a very brave government that's going to increase, say, personal taxes in order to fund more competitive business taxes. There's a very good economic case for doing that, but it's politically unrealistic.
Thank you. Alex, I mean, surely chancellors, prime ministers have always gamed the system, haven't they? Whatever the system is that they've got in place or put them, either externally or that they put in place. So, but is there a case for kind of saying, well, how could we get away from that? And is there a case for saying there are times of stress for the country and for everyone where you should actually be able to find a way of putting that to one side?
Well, we've been through such a time of stress already. We basically suspended all normal economic rules during coronavirus. We spent like a country that it was at war. We deliberately tanked our economic activity. We consciously drove economic activity in a country into the ground. So many observers will look at this and say, well, I want to get back to normal, or I want to get closer towards normality where rules do apply because of what we've been through. So agree with David, no chance politically of uplift on personal tax prior to an election. But on the other hand, our first, I think, point of disagreement, David rightly points out, we've had 13 years of suspending the raise in fuel duty. I think the odds have got to be at least as good of having a 14th year rather than suddenly the government deciding in an election year coming up to raise fuel duty. But to answer both, I think your and Andrew's question about why can't we, change the rules so that things are viewed differently. We at FTI had the Chief Secretary to the Treasury in yesterday, and John Glenn was asked broadly the same kind of question. How can we as businesses think about the long term when we know these things you're doing, whether they be sensible measures or discounts or, sales in the shop window, depending on your perspective for the UK, given that we know those are going to drop away. And the frank answer from government is that we're trying to telegraph to people we hope to have these things carry on, but that if you put them on a permanent basis, then we have to score them and we have to put them in the long-term economic forecasts. And I think on which I think we'll all agree, especially given the events of last year, government is now terrified of the OBR and being found to be on the wrong side of the Office of Budget Responsibility. Now, because we're all British and very polite about it, people are quite reluctant to point out that the OBR's forecasts in recent times have shown what might charitably be described as flexibility in the way that they have changed from saying, recession's coming, no, it's not, government's going to have no money, it's going to have tens of billions, the next quarter looks bad, the next quarter looks good. But in any case, it's clear that this government, and Sunak, especially given the experience of Liz Truss's short-lived premiership, does not want to get on the wrong side of the OBR. Consider the delight that the Chancellor took at the dispatch box yesterday, talking about how each and every one of the quarters to come are now forecast as being growth quarters rather than quarters of economic contraction. And that, I think, is going to be a feature going into the next election. And that, I think, answers, in part at least, Andrew's question about why we don't have long-term activity in these things. Because if you put them in the long term, you've got to score them on your tax base, you've got to score them in your economic forecasting, and it will mean a bit of a dip and a drag on what UK government can do. Just one other thing on that. The attitude from UK government is very much that when we had a lower corporation tax rate than many of our colleagues and neighbours in Europe, businesses took advantage of it to a large degree, but only invested from that saving to a very small degree. So that's why they've got this view now of raising corporation tax, but effectively giving you all of that back, potentially, if you invest rather than just take the money, return it to shareholders and take it as profit.
Thank you. We're going to start to deep dive a little bit into some of the themes. I'm going to come to Cara in a minute just to sort of pick up the conversation we've already started around the workforce, getting more people economically active. But before we do that, thank you to Robert Gordon-Clark for the first question of the morning. And I think it could be a levelling up question or an anti-levelling up question, but I think it's also a sort of broad political question. So I'm going to ask it now. Does the lack of any real focus on London reinforce the assumption that the Tories have more or less given up on the capital politically? Where shall I go with that? David, you're laughing. Why don't I start with you again, and then I'll go around I'm sure Andrew's got a view on this too.
Well, yeah, it's an interesting one. I mean, look, London is pretty disastrous for the Conservatives electorally. And there are scenarios at the next general election where the Conservative Party could be down to sort of one MP in London at a sort of worst case scenario. I suppose worst case is none, but they're clearly in retreat. There are far fewer Conservative MPs in London today with a very comfortable Tory majority than there was after John Major sort of just held on in 1992. And I think that's evidence of the sort of retreat of the Conservative Party from London. Yeah, there's a lot. I mean, I think when it kind of comes to London, it's unlikely that the budget will mention London very much. I mean, there is a sort of focus on financial services to some extent, which is not just London by any means, but London is sort of part of it. But look, electorally, the government is going to talk much more about the North and the Midlands, hence all the investment zones, the 12 new investment zones are in those areas rather than London. There's an interesting sort of line in there about Oxford to Cambridge corridor, which I have to say I'm pleased to see, and something about boosting that area and planning. There's a sort of chronic shortage of laboratory space in Cambridgeshire in particular, so there's clearly something to come on that part of the world as well. But when it comes to the headlines, what the a big part of the government's narrative is about levelling up. It is about supporting those regions that have done less well in recent decades, and so the rhetoric is very much going to be focused on those places, not London. That's not to say there won't be things that help London, but that's not going to be front and foremost of the messaging.
Thanks, Andrew.
Yeah, I mean, whether they've given up on it politically, I'm not sure, but they definitely can't give up on it economically, right? I mean, London is 25% of the national economy. The work that we published last week shows us about 50% of the reason for the terrible productivity performance we've had over the last decade. So there's a kind of big question economically about London and about how we deal with that. But when you look at, I think, at some of what the policies that you would think about improving London's performance, they tend then to be often macro in orientation. Obviously, there's a big question about Brexit and the degree to which London is able to access international markets, given its very international focused economy. There's questions about the migration system, or kind of people coming in and the high skilled visas. That matters massively to London because it takes about 50% of the people coming into the country typically find their way to London to work. There's big questions, as David said, around the planning system and the degree to which it enables residential and commercial. Some of that is kind of in the gift of a sort of London orientated policy framework, but actually many of these decisions will need to be made by national government, which then feeds through into London. My one political point would be, in some respects, although I am in favour of it, completely in favour of it, I think the introduction of the ULEZ may do some benefit for the Conservatives at the mayoral level, even if it doesn't transpire at the MP level when we get to the next set of elections.
Thank you. Okay, let me move us on then, Cara. So we've talked quite a bit already about skills, economically active people, getting more people back into the workforce and keeping them there. Did the Chancellor do enough? What more could he have done, do you think? And do you think that might be coming still?
Yeah, so I think we saw some really major policy interventions in this space. I think we were kind of expecting. We know that inactivity has risen quite sharply, particularly over the pandemic years. And we know that if you're trying to boost long-term growth, increasing your workforce is a really important lever in that. So I guess probably worth thinking about this in sort of three chunks. He looked at childcare, disability benefits, and then also kind of action for older workers. I think childcare is probably the really major announcement that we were kind of expecting again. I got a lot of briefing before this budget. But we saw about £5.4 billion of spending on childcare and early year support for parents by the end of the forecast. I think a focus that's really welcome. We know there's been a lot of progress on participation in the workforce for women with children. We know it works. We also know there's still a long way to go. I think, as Alex was mentioning, a lot of women do still drop out of the workforce at the point they have children. So I think there was a couple of elements to this policy, one of which was sending 3 hours of childcare for children who are 9 months old all the way up to 3 years. I think that's probably the kind of main headline policy people have taken away from the budget. I think it's really welcome. It's worth saying, though, that a big chunk of this benefit is going to higher income families. They currently receive very little childcare support for children under 3. So it's probably those middle to higher income households who are benefiting the most from this policy. You might think that, I mean, in some ways, it's also redistributing to the most expensive part of people's lives, sort of having children element. So that may be something you kind of feel more or less positively about. But But I think this is also an intervention that looks like it is in the OBR's forecast going to have a really big impact on participation. So boosting kind of supply of workers by about 60,000 in 2027-28, and about a further 15,000 from removing monthly caps on childcare spending and universal credit as well. So I think a really big, quite positive policy intervention, really benefiting those on higher incomes, though, I think more than those on lower incomes. On disability and kind of ill health benefits, again, a really good area to target. So we know that the employment gap between people with disabilities and those without disabilities has been closing over time in the UK. Progress is possible there. And we also know that sickness and disability has risen really sharply over the past few years. So about 350,000 more people are economically inactive as a result of long-term sickness since the start of the pandemic. So this sort of white paper is really welcome. It's dealing with sort of very far-reaching reforms are a really tricky bit of the benefit system. So I think great that the government's recognising the need for reform there, but I think only the start of a change that's going to take a really long time to implement. We're probably talking about changes that probably won't be rolled out into the 2030s. And they also are, it's a very complex area. They are likely to produce some really big sort of winners and losers, I guess, from this policy. They're talking about scrapping the work capability assessments. That determines whether you move on to this higher level of universal credit because you're unable to work for health issues. It's separate from the other type of disability support in our system, so personal independence payments. That's people with longer term health conditions. It's not means tested. It's about conditions that affect your day-to-day life rather than just your ability to work. So what the government's proposed is that instead of having this work capability assessments, this binary, can you work, can't you work? If you go into work, you risk losing your benefits because you're now suddenly deemed able to work. Instead, you have kind of one health element, and it's this personal independence payment assessment. People with shorter term health conditions could really lose out there. I assume when this is implemented, there'll be some kind of cutouts to make sure that people who have temporary illnesses, like some cancer patients, pregnant women, if you're recovering from operation, don't really lose out from that change. So potentially some good news there, but really remains to be seen what will actually be implemented. I think finally on the sort of older workers side, I think this side, probably the smaller end of the kind of impacts on inactivity, mainly aiming to keep older, highly paid public sector workers in the workforce through the scrapping of the lifetime allowance, as Alex mentioned a bit earlier. I don't think particularly well targeted. So about 61% of the people with pension pots who would actually kind of find some material policy change are actually in the private sector. So not these kind of highly paid public sector workers are trying to incentivize to keep in work, and quite an expensive measure. So the OBR, I thought this one would increase employment by about 15,000. It costs 1.2 billion a year, so that's about 80 grand a job. So I think probably other measures they could have used to incentivize older workers staying in work that would have been a bit better targeted. So whether that's kind of capping tax-free lump sums more or increasing the age which people access private pensions. I'm sure those with more sort of political knowledge on this panel will realise why they didn't do those things. But I think on the economic side, the kind of older workers policy bucket was perhaps less effective.
Thank you. A couple of things I wanted to follow up on in there. So when you were describing how complicated, particularly the changes, plans around disability are going to be and how long term that's going to be, my blood did run slightly cold because I'm not sure government always has a great record of implementing really complicated long-term change in the welfare system or indeed in anywhere else. So how confident are you that actually that's a systemic change, that it's likely that we'll get right?
I mean, it's definitely aiming to be this kind of systemic change, removing the work capability assessment is obviously in some respects really welcome, right? Like we know that this kind of binary can't people work just doesn't reflect the reality of a lot of people's lives and the kind of work they might want to take on or to try temporarily. So I think, like you say, it's a really welcome focus, and kind of making changes in this area is a really good aim. It's going to be really tricky. I think any kind of changes to the benefit system, you risk making really big kind of winners or losers in these situations, and in ways that are obviously very central to how people live their lives. So I think, yeah, it's definitely going to be a long process, but good that they're sort of consulting on it and they're beginning to think about these very thorny issues, but probably one that we'll only see progress on in the next Parliament.
Yeah, then my second question was, could the government have done more for lower income individuals and families? I mean, you touched on that it was mainly actually going to benefit, you know, sort of the middle income, something for higher earners, because for people who've got particular problems in particular parts of the market. But what more could they have done for lower income families, do you think?
Yes, I think I probably should mention a bit more on the childcare side, that there are, I think, changes to provide childcare costs upfront in universal credit are really positive ones for low income groups. We know that kind of only providing those costs in arrears, lumping them in with a main universal credit payment that fluctuates, people don't know how much they're getting for the childcare costs in that month, is really not a positive thing in the current system. So that change, I think, is really good for kind of people towards that sort of low income groups. I think there's probably more in the cost of living side we'd like to see, particularly things maybe your audience probably know more about than I do, but on sort of local housing allowance, we know that the support people to pay their rents has been frozen at the level of 2019 rents the past few years. We know since then private rents have increased quite substantially, and there's a lot of people for whom the kind of housing subsidy they're receiving is just not keeping pace with the cost that they're trying to meet. So I think on the cost of living side, it would have been great to see some more action there.
Thank you. Andrew, I'm going to come to you as our levelling up guru, whatever the right word to be.
It's not that, but still, I thank you for it nevertheless.
let's talk devolution and levelling up. So we've got the new trailblazers for the West Midlands and Greater Manchester. We've got the investment zones. We've got another round of levelling up funding. We've got levelling up partnerships. Tell us, give us, I'm going to ask you a nice broad question so you can come at it any way you like, because there's loads we could talk about there.
Yeah.
But give us a kind of a snapshot of, is that all coherent? Is that welcome? Did it go far enough? Could he have done more? Pick your theme to respond on.
Yeah, so I think if you think about some of the announcements made, I would say, if you think about levelling up and devolution, I think both strands showed an increasing degree of prioritization, and I think that is a good thing. One of the constant critiques of levelling up, in a sense, is that's everything for everywhere all at the same time, and there's no sense of prioritization. So I think there is prioritization, and I think there are two ways to kind of think about this. I think increasingly when you look through not just the budget statement, but the related materials around investment zones, etc., that I think the government is increasingly of the mind that big cities and mayors are important to national economic growth. I'm not going to overstate that, but I think increasingly they see that as a thing that they need to grapple with, and I think that's a good thing. And you see that because, and the evidence is there, they back them. So they backed them through the trailblazers. This was announced in the Levelling Up white paper 12 months ago. We now have at least the bones of the trailblazer deals with two big cities, Greater Manchester and West Midlands, or Greater Birmingham in many respects. And that's a good thing, right? I mean, in a sense, these places matter to their regions. They matter to the national economy, two biggest economies outside of London. But you also see then, when you look at where the investment zones are, they aren't going to be everywhere. The trust model was basically everywhere, hundreds and hundreds of them. We're now down to a relatively smallish number of 8 or 12 across the UK. But again, all of the mayors, most of the mayors and their combined authorities, which are essentially by and large, but not exclusively, big city economies, they will have them, in a sense. So I think there's a good prioritization on that. And then the third element, which I think is really encouraging, but actually undercovered, is that the budget also made a statement that the city region transport settlement, which is about £9 billion worth of cash, is going to be renewed for another 5-year term. And that is fantastic. Again, an emphasis on big city regions and transport being a critical part of the infrastructure that we need to get right. So I think there's a really good and encouraging sort of emphasis and prioritization. So I'm slightly relaxed about, people go, we need to do more everywhere. We need to go fast. I think the prioritization, and these things are hard, right? I mean, talk to anybody involved, they're difficult. I think the second strand, which again, I'm again entirely relaxed about, I think the government is increasingly going, okay, so we're going to do that, But we've also got these levelling up funds and special pots, which we all obviously detest in various ways and to various degrees. But in many respects, they're less interested and they're less important. Now, they're important to the places that get the money or not get the money, but in a national economy perspective, they are less important. So there's a kind of demarcation, I think, between two of these strands, which I think is helpful for us then when we think about how we develop policy programs and policy packages for different parts of the country. So overall, in that kind of space, I think I was pretty positive. And I think, if you look at the detail of the investment zones, we can debate the principle, but if you're going to do them, I think the way that they've evolved and been reformed, given what they were originally, I think is a step in the right direction, definitely.
Yeah. I suppose the mood music at MIPIM, where I've been, and I know some people who are dialed in have been this week, I think was welcoming of that strategy and those investment zones, but a real nervousness that actually we won't get on and implement them. That, there'll be kind of the whole rule book needs to be written and a whole load of hoops have to be gone through that mean you actually don't make much progress. Just to go back to where we started in terms of delivery over
that's a fair point. It goes to David's point. I think we're always, those of us in the game, we say, look, we want long-term strategy, we want long-term planning, and then we criticize governments when they put out long-term plans because they're not doing something immediate, right? That's just the way of the world. That's why definitely I would never be a politician. So hats off to those that have or currently are. So I think, in some respects, immediate actions are what they are, but we're trying to see what into the future. The obvious point is, had we started this in 2019 when the original idea of leveling up, then would have been 4 years in rather than still in the foothills. But that's a slightly different story. These things do take time. They will take time inevitably, but the sooner we start, then the sooner we get it. So again, I'm a bit more relaxed on the immediacy of the types. It's not the way to think of these kinds of things. And devolution is ongoing. It'll be never finished, etc. But we are making progress, I think.
Yeah, and maybe part of the answer is that, with the investment zones, that actually, because the government has been targeted, and I completely agree with you on that, they have some confidence. They're not sort of throwing money into a local authority. They may or may not have confidence can actually do something strategically important with it.
Yeah, if you're super optimistic and you say, there's a continuity here, there's a very clear signal, which you see in other countries, which is, certain, our big cities are important. That's not political points, an economic point. And government says that and signals that very clearly. The individual policies change over time, but Greater Manchester remains a prioritised area, Greater Birmingham, etc. And that I should release and get the positive responses from the investment community, from the business community, from the entrepreneurial community, because we know that they are ongoing prioritizations with, the policy mix varies on a case by case basis.
Alex, what are you hearing from clients around the sort of the strategy around levelling up and devolution and where it's taking us?
Lots of interest, especially north of the border, with the that people have charted this and been wrong every time. You're once foolish to forecast the fall of the SNP, but certainly a dropping away of support for the Scottish nationalists is one of the most important things happening in our devolved authorities. I think that that's likely to be to the benefit of the Labour Party at the next election, which on the one hand will not be viewed tremendously by Conservatives hoping to cling on to a majority. On the other hand, will be warmly welcomed by Unionists who value the existence of our union. But I appreciate the conversation predating that point was more about the English devolutionary environment. And I would point out, I think two of the things we've been talking about are linked. The earlier question you had about government's lack of confidence in London, which David is right, is not a Tory city. He's trending away from the Conservative Party, and Boris Johnson's mayoralty was an exception rather than an indicator of normal political life. London, where support is trending away from the Tories, and in regions, not just in the ones we've discussed, but also in Tees Valley, where the Conservative Party has done extremely well electorally. And I think these two things might well be connected, that the Conservative Party has more confidence in government, is more comfortable in government, talking about and dealing with people in devolved authorities when they are also Conservatives. Maybe that shouldn't be the case, but I just think realistically and pragmatically it is. And the rise of the Houchins and some bits of that West Midlands area represented by Andy Street are also strong examples of the kind of levelling up success, which has got a very patchy record. But, though there are bits there that you can see are successful for government. And in much the same way as the Red Wall, places you might not have expected to see Conservative success, but demonstrates the shift from, say, the Cheshams and Amershams of this world, which used to be rock solid Tory seats and are now disinclined for different reasons to vote Conservative, to seats that used to be rock solid Labour seats and are now willing increasingly in their working class vote to give or lend their vote to the Conservative Party. And we're seeing that right across the piece, where newish Conservative MPs, realising they may not actually have that long, very keen to engage with business, very keen to try and attract business to their constituency and be able to say, look at what I helped to deliver, look at what a Conservative MP here communicating well with government can deliver, as opposed to someone from another party.
Thank you. David, welcome your thoughts around this whole area as well, but also maybe one little specific question for you, so local enterprise partnerships now dead. Does it matter? Will they be mourned? And what's the political reason for that?
It's an interesting question as to what sort of happened with LEPs, because I think you can make a sort of strong argument. You've got to have the sort of private sector involved in these areas. It brings a sort of level of expertise and a viewpoint that is really valuable. And so I hope this doesn't mean that business is essentially weakened in this area. I think it's a sort of slightly sort of curious one. I mean, I very much agree with Andrew's comments that the focus now is on mayors and is on cities, and I think that is right. I mean, it's always been a concern I've had that levelling up was spread too thinly, and there was a lack of recognition of the importance of agglomeration effects. And if you want agglomeration effects, go to cities, and if you make the cities successful, then the surrounding areas are likely to sort of respond to that. And I think that was the sort of right approach. And this is not, I mean, we've sort of come full circle, because I was in the Treasury when George Osborne was going on about the Northern Powerhouse, and the Northern Powerhouse was all about the cities and trying to bring the big cities of the North and the Midlands together. And I've always felt that was the right model, and I think we went in the wrong direction on all of this. There is clearly a move towards greater devolution. I think that will continue, whoever is in power after the next election. I think it's an agenda that the Labour Party are embracing as well, and probably may even go further. And so I wonder, partly coming back to your question, Melanie, is whether the sort of LEPs are stepping back because it is a focus on cities, and a focus on cities means mayors, and that's where we go. But I think it would be a great pity if and look, maybe this is a point for democratic accountability. A good mayor will engage and consult closely with business and understand businesses' needs, and it works that way rather than through the sort of the constitutional setup of LEPs. But I would see this also as sort of part of the move towards cities. And by the way, the link with universities, I think, is also important. Another criticism I've had about some of the rhetoric on levelling up is that there's been a degree of there's a degree of nostalgiaism about it, and it's kind of, can't we go back to the days where we had the sort of big factory at the end of the street and so on, and if we want to revive the country and those parts of the country that have not done so well, it's got to be forward looking. So yes, I think that focus on innovation, focus on universities, devolution, and as I say, I think that's an agenda that will persist regardless of who wins the next general election.
Thank you. And for those who've missed it in the chat, Alex is agreeing with you, but pointing out that actually, if you're going to load all that accountability onto local leaders, they need the money to be able to deliver on it. Let's move on and talk about housing. We've got another question from the floor, the virtual floor on that. So almost nothing. I mean, Cara, you touched on it earlier in terms of rent supports, but almost nothing on housing and nothing on housing delivery. Despite the fact that the shortage in supply across all tenures actually continues and has a material impact on people's quality of lives and cost of living and so on. So has the government given up on housing, do you think, Cara, or is it just accepted that this isn't something where they can say something meaningful before the election?
Yeah, no, I think it's definitely something. There's a kind of notable omission in this budget. I think there's a picture going around on Twitter of the kind of housing headline in the budget document and 3 bullet points underneath, and one of them's on potholes. So I think obviously not that potholes aren't very important, but yeah, definitely an omission in this budget. I think, as you said, there's some really big issues to tackle here. So supply, obviously, also things like retrofitting, green homes. That's a huge kind of issue to deal with, huge kind of policy area. A lot of critiques still about our property taxation system and council tax kind of applying very flatly across the board and not really capturing a lot of housing wealth. I think those are all extremely thorny issues, right? I think it's really coming back to this point that I think David and Alex made at the start, that these are really tricky, they're very controversial issues. It's potentially unlikely that Chancellor's going to try and deal with those immediately before an election. So we might have been waiting for the next Parliament to get answers on those. I think there's also probably a fiscal side to this as well. So I think we were maybe slightly surprised we didn't see an extension of the Help to Buy scheme. It's not one that it's been done particularly well in kind of reviews, government reviews or National Audit Office reviews of kind of the efficiency of that scheme. A lot of that funding tends to go to people who would already buy houses, but it's the first time in over a decade we've not had the Help to Buy scheme as part of the property landscape. I think surprising maybe they didn't choose to extend that, and that probably is more to do with fiscal reasons, in that it's a scheme that doesn't increase your borrowing, it does increase your debt because the lending part of that. And if you're trying to meet a debt falling rule in the 5th year of the forecast, you've got very small margins to do that. Probably wasn't going to be possible against fiscal targets. So yeah, definitely an omission in this budget.
Thanks, Alex. I mean, a leading question, but beyond all leading questions, but I'm sure you agree with that. But do you think it was right, and what should he have done?
So there's some basic truths here that are unavoidable. 60s, 70s and 80s, we saw about twice the house building that you saw in the 90s, noughties and teens in this century. And that is obviously down to governments of both stripes, given the periods that I'm talking about. But most of all, it sits with the party to which I belong, the Conservative Party, which is just not building enough homes, and it's not allowing the building of enough homes. And if the government is willing, I thought Cara's point was very interesting, because if the government's willing enough to talk about something like potholes and use an individual example, it should do the same with a couple of high-profile examples of things that would help people on the housing ladder. The southeast of England, the entire region, is now just insanely overhyped for property. You need circa 13 times earnings to get a mortgage in the southeast of England now for homes that would once have been considered completely average or normal. Even in the last couple of years, to the point that was made about London earlier, to get on that housing ladder as a first-time buyer with a 10% deposit in London in 2019, you needed £60,000 to £65,000. Well, that's now over £100,000. There will be the occasional example of somebody who's had a 35% pay uplift in the last 4 years, but there ain't many of them, right? So it's not reflecting that people are being squeezed out of an entire region of our country because we're not building enough homes. And in the end, it's because it suits many people in the political narrative to allow that to continue. A government will say we need to build 200,000 more homes, and they fail to hit that target. And the next year, the government says, we need to build 200,000 more homes. And no one says, well, hang on a minute, there's a problem with the maths. If you were 50,000 short last year, surely that's got to go up on the number you're aiming at this year. And like I say, it suits a number of people to have Conservative voters squeezed out of seats around London that are becoming more Labour reliant and piled up in shire seats, which the Tories were going to win anyway. That's certainly a part of it. It also suits a number of people who have direct financial interest, that is, homeowners, and we've got to realise there's a flip side to that question: the next generation that wants to get on the housing ladder. And so all of those things, I think, are probably things we can agree with. What should government have done instead? They should have indicated a willingness to use poor agricultural land and disused facilities and sites, things like golf courses, which are currently still counted as part of the Green Belt, a strategy which has strangulated cities since being introduced. The trouble is, I'm a rare conservative in being willing to say that openly.
Thanks, Alex. Andrew, do you think as part of the sort of the vision and this, the kind of long-term approach around levelling up, housing should have at least been talked about as so central to that strategy?
Yes, but so I think this is where, and we've talked about this already, I think that you have to hold these two things in together. So in a sense, in a strict levelling up context, i.e., as David was saying, we're thinking essentially about everywhere outside of the greater southeast. And once you do that, in a sense, housing pressures are not as extreme as the ones that Alex have said, and they're of a slightly different nature. You know, it's about the form and function of our places rather than just being, you know, a kind of overwhelming supply problem. In a sense, we don't have enough. So, but if you think of it like that, then housing is less of an urgent issue for you to deal with relative to other things. Whereas if you think about national economic growth, right, and the terrible performance of the national economy over the last 15 years, and, you know, no wage growth, standards of living, you know, fairly stagnant, etc., then you bring back in the greater southeast perspective, which is what Alex was saying, and that leads you to ask much more fundamental questions about housing, and particularly the cost of housing in those sorts of places. So in some respects, you know, depending on where you start from, you know, you were able to ignore some of it or underplay some of it. None of it is helpful. And, you know, it's exactly the same point that David made about, you know, the Oxford-Cambridge corridor, right? In a sense, for a levelling up point of view, ignore it. National economic growth perspective, absolutely vital. You've got to do it. But, you know, so these kind of confused conversations don't really help, which is why I think some of the issues around prioritization and how we think about the different role of different places in the national economies is actually more important, rather than get this sort of sideshow of, well, what does all leveling up kind of mean? And that, you know, I think, as I said, I think there is some encouragement there. But as Alex said, you know, there are some big political challenges around housing, and particularly in the greater southeast, which Mr. Gove has said many times during his current tenure that he's had a go and he's not made any progress.
Oh, I am. Thank you. Rookie error. My goodness me. Must be my MIPIM sleep deprivation. I'm going off slightly at a tangent, but it's linked to something you just said, Andrew. So there's another question from the virtual floor. How will the 12 potential investment zones choose the area that they wish to benefit from the investment zone? Do you want to have a crack at that one? I mean, I'm guessing
rationally and evidence-based, obviously, would be my glib response. But essentially, which, you know, we'll see what happens. If you look at the details, so basically, you know, there will be an investment zone type proposition or proposal that comes from the combined authorities in England, at least, and then England, Wales and Scotland, Northern Ireland will get at least one as well. At the minute, it does need to be evidence-based, and there needs to be a rationale laid out. But the actual location and how it all fits together, at the minute, the ball is going to be in the MCA court or in the mayor's court to actually decide the exact nature. Obviously, there'll be negotiation and conversation with government rightly on these kinds of things, but it'll be for those places to determine how they actually want to organize it and then bring it forward, which again, I think is a good thing. And it will force the MCAs themselves and the mayors to make some decisions about prioritization about certain places more than others. So I think that's how we'll see it play out over the next 12 months.
Thank you. David, Cara mentioned retrofit, so let's just talk sustainability and net zero for a minute. Something else we didn't hear very much of in the budget. Why do you think that was? Are we waiting for the government to decide what it wants to do with Chris Skidmore's review?
Yeah, I think that's what it is. So we've got Green Day coming up. I think it'll be the last week of March. I've heard the 27th or the 30th as potential days for that. That's when they'll do their response to Skidmore's review. And I mean, actually, Chris did something for McFarlane's earlier this week on that, and you know, it was a very well received report. There's a lot in there. and I think it's reasonable for the government to try to sort of address it on a special day rather than it being sort of slipped out on the budget. Where are they likely to focus? I think it is going to be about energy. I think it's going to be about carbon capture, usage and storage. Those I think are going to be the big themes. I have a slight sense that when it comes to sort of energy efficiency, the Cambridge University report that came out in January that says the evidence, if you improve home energy efficiency, is that people just heat their homes more, and that it doesn't have the carbon reduction impact that people once thought. I get a sense that has really sort of permeated across government, that people have noticed this, and I wonder whether that means that energy efficiency has sort of been somewhat downgraded. I could be wrong, and don't shoot the messenger on this, but that's my slight sense on that, and therefore I think the focus is going to be about energy, partly in the sort of narrative of energy security as well, and as I say, CCUS. But again, I think it also comes back to planning, and again, point that we hear quite a lot is a sort of frustration in terms of sort of planning on renewables, et cetera, and I think that's going to be a sort of big issue, and I personally think a political vulnerability for the government if it doesn't sort this out. And to be honest, I think that was perfectly apparent a year ago. In fact, the moment when it was clear that Russia was going to invade Ukraine, I was surprised that the government wasn't pulling sort of every lever to reverse its position on onshore wind and to be more supportive of solar farms, et cetera, and I think they've still got some way to go on that.
You're not giving much comfort to those, I think, in the audience who are hoping finally for some clarity around minimum energy efficiency standards.
Yeah, no, please don't shoot the messenger. I'm merely assessing where I think sort of government might be. But we shall see. As I say, my guess is it's going to be on those two issues of energy production and carbon capture. I think will be the highlights.
So we're coming to the end of the session. We've got one unanswered question for the floor, which I hope the panelists have all seen and are dreading me coming to them to answer. But the question is, did you count how many times science was mentioned in the budget? And I guess what lies behind that is a point of view around its importance to the strategy for economic growth and recovery. Anyone want to have a crack at that?
I confess I didn't count, but we have got a new sort of science department. There was a science strategy announced. There is stuff within the sort of red book about kind of more to come, and there's quite a lot of focus on the balance review and the sort of particular sectors. And I think the Blair Hague paper on science policy has attracted a lot of attention as well, and William Hague is very close to Rishi Sunak. So I do think that this is something that the Prime Minister wants to develop pretty strongly.
And does that need? I mean, that needs, doesn't it, to be integrated into all of the other things that we've been talking about? Andrew, come back to you.
Yeah, no, well, I think it is, and I think in some respects you saw that in the budget, and it just as an example in a sort of my field, the reformed investment zones have a much stronger emphasis on investment in the STEM activities, and then the connection to the universities and to R&D more generally. They weren't originally in that kind of space. So I think there's a recognition by government that these are the things that ultimately drive prosperity, and we need to think about how we can marshal not only in a very narrow sense science and technology, but actually we provide the support in infrastructure to make those kinds of things work. And you saw that obviously in the budget, but you saw that in the Chancellor's speech a few weeks before the budget, and obviously the Prime Minister's speech before he was Prime Minister, the May's lecture, plus speeches he's made in the interim period as well. So I think there is a recognition and an emphasis, and I would say, although we talked about the government, you see this a corresponding emphasis increasingly on the Labour Party side as well. I think if you see some of the material, there's a recognition that we are good on some things, and much of it is in the science technology field, and we need to be better and bigger in those sorts of things in the future for the economy and for the country to be prosperous.
Thank you very much. We have come to the end of our time, sadly. So the panelists are off the hook for that closing question that on a panel you always dread, which is kind of, give me your wish list, give me your future thoughts, what could have been done differently. I don't have time to ask that question, although we could go on for much, much longer. But I hope you found that useful and informative. I certainly have. Thank you, all of you, for joining us. Thank you to my fabulous panel for their honesty and engagement in all of the things we've talked about. And we will see you this time next year, roughly, for our next post-budget webinar, where I think we will be talking much more about what the Chancellor did to make us all want to go out and vote Conservative at the next election, which will then be, I guess, 6 months off. So thank you all very much. Enjoy the rest of your Fridays and have a great weekend.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank
Thanks
you.
very much.